Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Capizzi. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. I want to welcome you and just thank you for joining us this afternoon for our discussion with Carter Snead. Carter Snead is a friend of mine and also a professor of law at the University of Notre Dame. In addition to being a professor of law, he runs Notre Dame's Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, really one of the leading centers in the country that concerns itself with Catholic intellectual teaching and concerns about human life. Carter also is one of the leading internationally recognized theoreticians of public bioethics. And what we're discussing today is his new book, What It Means to Be Human, which is really a wonderful book that looks at the law and its role in thinking about certain kinds of moral questions and discovering the moral anthropology that lies at the basis of these different views. I want to thank Carter, first of all, for joining us and welcome him to say a word to us. He's been, like I said, a friend of ours for a while, and it's been long a desire of mine for us at the Institute for Human Ecology to partner with Carter, and now having the opportunity to read his book, which I've done in concert with actually teaching a class on bioethics, has really been a gift to me. The timing, I think, for this book is fantastic. And Carter, one thing that I found in particular that's interesting about the way you've written this book, and such a contrast to the way conversation in the United States is occurring right now, is that you've done an extraordinary job being fair to all of the positions and that you discuss and engage throughout the book. Can you tell me or tell us just a little bit about, first, what prompted the book? What sort of motivated you to write this book now? And then secondly, how are you able to maintain such an even-handed approach to views that you deeply disagree with when right now our culture struggles to engage other people without either perverting their view or attacking them as people rather than attacking the view?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. Same as you, I've wanted to do something with the Institute for Human Ecology for a long time. It's an essential institution in American society and American intellectual life within our church, to be a wonderful locus of thinking and deliberation and reflection and public engagement. So as a person who runs a center at the University of Notre Dame, I'm a huge admirer of what you're doing there at the Catholic University of America, and I'm proud to be part of your work in this small way. So why did I write the book? I wrote the book because I've been working in what I describe as public bioethics for almost 20 years. First as the general counsel of the President Bush's Council on Bioethics under the leadership of Dr. Leon Kass. And my role as general counsel was to focus on the legal and public policy dimensions of the ethical issues that the council had under consideration. And so the field of public bioethics is a field of law. It's a field of law and public policy. It's the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. And something that I noticed from the very early on in my career working on these kinds of questions, especially on what I describe as the vital conflicts in the book of abortion, assisted reproductive technology, end-of-life decision-making, certainly not limited to those areas, but those are areas in which the issues that I'm concerned about come into very sharp relief. One thing I notice is that the law, in a lot of respects in the United States and internationally, does a very bad job of protecting extremely vulnerable populations. Children, both born and unborn, the disabled, the elderly, people who are members of stigmatized minorities or disfavored groups in a society. They frequently fall between the cracks in our efforts, even our good faith efforts, to extend the protections of the law to these vulnerable communities. And I wondered why that was. And for years, I sort of grappled with the question. And the more I learned about how law works generally, and the more I sort of embraced the notion that because law exists to promote the flourishing of persons and to protect persons, maybe the problem with the law in this area is the underlying premises about what a person is and what constitutes human flourishing. And that's not the same question as when life begins, although it's deeply connected to that question. It's really the question about who you and I are and what constitutes our flourishing and what we owe to each other, how do we stand in relation to each other. It's a question of what Walker Percy, famous Catholic novelist, called anthropology. You used the word in your introduction. It's the sort of, it's an account in its original sense of an account of what it means to be and flourish as a human being. And what I, in undertaking studies in this book, what I found was there's a vision of human identity and human flourishing at the core of these laws and policies that is deeply incomplete and therefore false, and results in a legal apparatus built on top of this foundation that's in many cases inhumane and unjust.
Yeah, that's great, and you do such a good job of describing with examples of how these failures have surfaced over time. So just so we're as clear as possible about the argument, so what you've discovered in your many experiences in doing public bioethics is that, like you said, the law fails to protect these vulnerable populations, and in fact, what you're saying is it fails because that law is working the way it ought to work because of its false anthropology. It's not failing to address these people, it's failing to identify them in the first place as persons.
They're invisible. They're invisible because the vision of what a person is doesn't include huge segments of the population, people who are suffering from cognitive impairments, people who are elderly, people who are disabled, even postnatal children. It can't give an account of what a baby is, even, because the vision of human identity that underwrites the laws in these areas is one of what I describe as expressive individualism. And we can talk more about that in a minute, but in short, it's identifying a person exclusively with their will and their desire, and seeing them through the lens of a radically individuated universe where we are basically atomized individual wills. And maybe that's the vision of the person that makes sense when you're dealing with able-minded people operating at the height of their cognitive powers without external coercive forces. And that's a pretty narrow sliver, of very privileged narrow sliver of the population.
Doesn't include me, right?
Yeah, no, me either. And it doesn't include everyone if you look at the full lifespan, obviously. There are moments in which everyone is radically dependent. And so when you design protections that are suited for that kind of a person, you miss entirely the populations of people who can't protect themselves in those ways.
Who can't even express their will, right? Who can't, and if they
can't even formulate a will, they can't even formulate desires, which some philosophers say is the prerequisite to having human rights, that you can't have human rights if you can't formulate the desire for human rights. That's Michael Tooley, who's one of the preeminent philosophical godfathers of our abortion legal regime here in this country.
It's just dynamite stuff. So you mentioned expressive individualism, which is a term you do use throughout the book. So why don't you just say a little bit about that? Obviously, it picks up on what we're talking about right now, but just say some more about that.
Yeah, so expressive individualism is a term that was coined by a man named Robert Bellah, who was an American social scientist who wrote a very famous book called Habits of the Heart in 1985. And in this book, he's a social scientist, he's a quantitative theorist, he interviewed hundreds of Americans, and his goal was to find out how Americans kind of understand themselves, understand what their basic personal reality is, what their destiny is, what their purpose is. And he found something that bothered him a lot. And he gave the name expressive individualism to the self-understanding of what these folks, these Americans, these normal everyday Americans thought of when they were asked the question of who do you think you are, and what do you think your flourishing consists in? And they, to a person, described a vision of human identity and flourishing that can be traced back really all the way to Rousseau, well, even before Rousseau, but I mean, starting with in the modern era, Rousseau's vision of the sort of internal sensibility, the internal voice that is the morally authoritative voice in defining who we are and what we should do. And people looked inside themselves to try to discern their own original authentic meaning, and then to configure their lives in a way that reflects and expresses that meaning, and they define their own destinies and they do so as an individual, irrespective of how they might or might not be embedded in relationships to other people, to their families, to communities, even, and this is my contribution to this discussion, even to their own bodies, right? Because the personal reality is the mind, is the will, and everything else is instrumental to realizing and pursuing the projects that one discovers inside him or herself. And this is, again, an anthropology that emerges in the Enlightenment, is picked up on and embraced by the Romantic literary movement, the writers and artists in that period who were rebelling against conceptions of harmony and rationality and people defining themselves by their roles. They made a move to what Charles Taylor calls authenticity, originality, finding in some cases, transgressive truths, subjective truths inside ourselves as a mechanism of expressing your true artistic vision. And then that becomes part of normal, and especially in the United States, normal self-conceptions and Bella has a theory of how this happened with respect to the advent of certain corporate forms and developments in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Very interesting genealogy that I trace in the book, but the bottom line is it's a vision of the person that what we are basically are disembodied, atomized wills whose highest flourishing is discovering and pursuing the truth that we find inside ourselves, and everything else, our bodies, nature, relationships, are all viewed through the lens of being instrumental to that purpose. And it's a vision that, as Alistair McIntyre says, is forgetful of the body. The only role the body plays in that vision is not as a locus of personal presence, but rather an instrument to be harnessed and wielded to pursue the projects of the will.
Yeah. And again, like one of the things that I think you do really well in the book is that you're respectful of these other positions. So even while you have this withering critique of expressive individualism, which you just, did such a great job of articulating, you nonetheless say at one point that it's not all false, right?
Right.
There are like partial truths that were advanced by this conception. I think you refer to human particularity and freedom, perhaps.
Yes.
Maybe just say, like, what was the gain? Why are people drawn to expressive individualism? There must be something there, right, that is speaking to them, right?
Well, it's something extremely, very attractive about that vision, right? The vision of the independent will seeking his or her own way in the world. It appeals to Americans, especially the sort of rugged individualism of the American historical culture, and it's not false, and it's not on its face false. It is the case that we experience ourselves as wills, we experience ourselves as particular beings, but the problem when you start to use that as your sole foundation for the anthropology that underlies law and policy is that because it misses crucial aspects of us, it's not the whole story about who we are. And the most important part of who we are in terms of public bioethics is, in fact, our vulnerability, our mutual dependence, and our natural limits, which are a function of our existence as embodied beings, and the body being integral to who we are, not merely accidental to who we are. So and Charles Taylor, a Catholic philosopher who I'm deeply indebted to in terms of his thinking about expressive individualism, in some of his works, and I don't talk about this in the book, is hesitant to throw expressive individualism over the side and abandon it entirely. It's important, and what I talk about my project in the book is to augment that anthropology, to fill out the picture, to embrace the realities of our embodied lives individually and in our shared lives, to take into account the realities of being an embodied being that are missing from a single-minded account that focuses only on expressive individualism.
Right. And you've connected already for us in this conversation expressive individualism to this dualism about the human person, right? A dualism that really esteems the will, right, and the sort of expressive will of a rational human being pursuing desires that he or she presents, to herself, against the body, right, and bodiliness. Body and bodiliness becomes a kind of impediment. You describe three sort of signal moments in the book. And I do want readers to read the book. It's really, I think, just so well done. It has that kind of novel, the character of a novel to it in the unfolding of these three signal events. But I want you to walk us through them. And before, just to finish the point about encouraging readers to read the book, apparently right now you're outselling Aristotle.
He's number 2, I'm number 1. So
yeah. So you can't get a better endorsement than Amazon lists, right?
Exactly. I think that's definitive, really, honestly.
Right. But give us, I think it's the Beecher Report, Tuskegee experiment, right? And then the experimentation that was done on live, fetuses,
newborns, who'd just been aborted. So I take 3 examples. So public bioethics is a field of law and policy is reactive. It's reactive to scandals. It's reactive, and that's not unusual. We frequently get legislation and judicial decisions that are reactive to public scandals. But that's really true of American public bioethics. So these three events, and people who focus on these questions date the beginning of American bioethics in different ways. Almost everybody talks about Tuskegee. Almost everybody talks about Beecher.
Right.
Henry Beecher was an anesthesiologist from Harvard who was really focused on the Nuremberg doctors' trial, in which the Nazi doctors were prosecuted for conducting unspeakable experiments on folks who were in concentration camps, unspeakably violent and exploitative experiments. And it led him to ask the question, well, what are we doing in the United States to protect human subjects? And in fact, at the Nuremberg trial itself, part of the defense counsel's argument was to the United States, to the prosecutors, well, the United States government doesn't have any definitive legal codes that govern and protect human subjects. And they were right about that. There was the American Medical Association Code, which was adopted in some ways in response to this lack that came up in the Nuremberg trial. But Beecher he took onto himself the task of studying these questions of human subjects protections. And human subjects protections is a unique context in itself, because it's an area of activity in which researchers, and there's actually a legal definition of scientific research in the federal law, which is a systematic investigation aimed at producing generalizable knowledge. So the purpose of human subjects research is not to heal people, is not to make someone well or to ameliorate their symptoms. The purpose is to obtain generalizable knowledge, and you quite literally use and instrumentalize human subjects to this end. And the ethical question is, how do you take that dangerous situation where there's the risk of exploitation and avoid those pitfalls, even with the most well-meaning scientific researchers? And the answer we settled on was the doctrine of informed consent, right? The idea of transforming that transaction of instrumentalization to collaboration, where you solicit the knowing, intelligent, and voluntary consent of a subject who participates in a protocol that they know, at least they've been told and understand at a certain level, is not designed to make them well, but is designed to obtain generalizable knowledge. And everyone involved hopes that if it's a clinical trial and they're getting a drug or a device, that it'll turn out to be effective and safe and helpful, and those person will benefit if they're in the cohort that even gets the drug and they're not in a control group that doesn't get it.
Right.
But there emerges in that context what's called the therapeutic misconception, where people who are desperate and want to be better sort of conflate the relationship between their researcher and their own physician. Sometimes it's actually the same person. But long story short, Beecher wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1966 detailing, I think, 22 experiments involving the most elite institutions in America, the US government, the Ivy Leagues, the most important institutes of research in the country, if not the world, in which there was no serious effort to secure the consent of the people involved, and in some cases involve people who were incapable of consent. And the sort of most shocking example to me is deliberately injecting children with intellectual disabilities at a place called Willowbrook on Staten Island. It was a facility for children with intellectual disabilities, and deliberately injecting these children with hepatitis in order to study the progress of the disease. And there was no meaningful consent secured. There was some discussion with some of the parents, but none of them expressed details about the risks involved. And this sent shockwaves. There are 22 of these cases, right? Cases involving prisoners, cases involving elderly people who were suffering from dementia in the New York Chronic Jewish Disease Hospital, being injected with live cancer cells without their consent, right? Without the possibility of consent. And this sent sort of shockwaves through the American public and raised the question of what do we do here? This is an extraordinary violation of vulnerable people. Tuskegee is a very similar story, a 40-year study of the American Public Health Service that's the federal government, going into Macon County, Alabama, and systematically deceiving poor African-American sharecroppers who suffered from syphilis about what they were doing, never told them why they were being examined. They were conducting a natural history study, watching the disease progress untreated through these populations, and it ravaged these populations. And most shameful of all, in the middle of the 1940s, when penicillin became a standard of care treatment for syphilis, they weren't given the syphilis, this penicillin, and there's credible reports, I think, that the researchers colluded with local health authorities to prevent these people from getting that treatment. That went on for 40 years, and in the 1970s came to the light in the American public, and people were equally scandalized and troubled by it. It's another story of exploitation of vulnerable people. And then the third example that I give in the book, which is not very well known actually, is a case involving a series of American researchers, probably funded by federal dollars, going to Scandinavia, where they perform abortions, where they used to perform abortions by basically doing C-sections and removing an intact baby alive and waiting for it to expire, or perhaps moving that along through some other medical intervention. And because the babies would come out, the newborns, and we're not talking about in utero human beings, we're talking about ex utero human beings outside the body, these doctors would go over there, and because these were such great subjects to perform experiments on, they would contract with the clinics and get the women involved, and they would perform horrific experiments on these imminently dying but still living newborns who had just been aborted. And that sent shockwaves, and in fact, people organized, and Sacred Heart Country Day School that is near where you live,
Right.
where was animated by that at Catholic High School, led by Maria Shriver, who later became First Lady of California, an accomplished journalist, daughter of Eunice Shriver, niece of Ted Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy. And that led to, all three of these events led to congressional hearings convened by Senator Edward Kennedy, which culminated in the National Research Act, which was the first federal statute that related to American public bioethics. It was the birth of American public bioethics. And that's important because it was, first of all, the scandals that emerged in that context show how human vulnerability, mutual dependence, and natural limits create the conditions of exploitation, right? That to which people are endangered. But then also it shows the inadequacy of the government response, because the primary response to all three of those instances involving exploitation of people not capable of autonomous consent was to shore up informed consent, to shore up mechanisms to vindicate autonomy and self-determination. And that's a kind of category mistake, because the people who needed the help don't benefit from legal structures that emphasize and advance self-determination and autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's just, it's almost overwhelming, right? It's the kind of thing that when you read it, or if, our listeners are just hearing this for the first time, it's just like, right, it just takes your breath away to think about just really the perversion of hearts that are involved in what seems like, just like you said before, viewing these human beings as invisible, right? Somehow not seeing them as members of one's own class of being. It's staggering, but your account leads us to conclude that this is the failure. It's precisely that failure to see these as human beings like the rest of us, because of some so malformed anthropological view that you can't even be confronted by the presence of these people and be shaken out of that view, right?
Yeah, the people are invisible, and that means that our obligations to them are invisible. Right. The anthropology of expressive individualism only recognizes those obligations that we freely choose. Again, the emphasis on being a choosing agent, right? The only people that have claims on me are people that I agree to help in advance. And in fact, if you read the most important and famous philosophical article of all time on abortion, Judith Jarvis Thompson's A Defense of Abortion, in which when she frames the question of abortion and the human context of abortion as analogous to a woman who's been abducted and had a violinist surgically attached to her body, who will depend on her body for 9 months as his kidneys come back into normal functioning. Right. If the very framing of the question of abortion as a clash of atomized individual wills, one's incapable of will, obviously the unborn child, two atomized individuals fighting over scarce resources, her statements about being a parent are chilling. She says there is no obligation to take care of one's own child absent a free, willing, and open consent to that relationship. There's no natural relationship that brings with it a kind of obligation to care. And there's a direct line from that assertion to the reasoning and holdings and law of American abortion jurisprudence. And in many respects, the laws connecting the end of life decision-making, and assisted suicide, and the absence of any meaningful law in the assisted reproductive technology context.
Right. Let's look at disability real quick, because it's something you discuss. It's a deep concern of ours at the Institute for Human Ecology. We've been working on
Yes,
issues around disability for a while now. I mean, it's at the heart, right, of
it is.
what a human being is. And you quote McIntyre, right, who says, effectively, right, all human beings are, a little disabled. I can't remember the exact
We
quote,
all
right?
exist on a scale of disability, he says.
Right, we all exist. I mean, this is completely a counterclaim. It's a repudiation of expressive individualism, isn't it?
It is. It's a total repudiation of expressive individualism. And it also points the way to what is missing from the operationalized framework in a community of relational embodied beings.
Right.
McIntyre, in his book, Dependent Rational Animals, talks about the virtues of acknowledged dependence, and he talks about those virtues subserving the most important feature on the human landscape for sustaining our lives and teaching us to be what we're supposed to be, which are what he calls networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. These human networks where people, without a transactional interest, without a contract, without consent, realize they have an obligation and assume that obligation happily to make the good of another person their own good. To
Right.
basically, and the most pristine example of this is the relationship of parent and child. And parents don't take care of their children because they have a contract to take care of their children. They don't do it because it's in their self-interest to do so, or they get something out of it, or they're hoping to get something back in return. They take care of their child in virtue of their relationship, because that's what a parent is one who has an obligation that runs to that child by virtue of that relationship. And the child doesn't have to earn the right to be cared for by his or her parent. They have that right in virtue of that relationship as well. Right is the right word, but they have that claim on the parent as a result of that relationship. And so, as the antidote to a world of strife, where atomized individual wills come into one another into conflict in adversarial ways, or perhaps in mutually beneficial contracts, which then break apart when those goals are no longer served, you have this very, to my mind, very beautiful vision of networks of giving and receiving on which we all depend, first for our survival, right? We come into the world because of our embodiment, radically dependent on our parents and others who care for us. But then over time, McIntyre makes this point, we become the thing that we're supposed to be, which he describes as an independent practical reasoner by virtue of our relationships and the narratives that emerge in these contexts. And we learn to become the kind of person that can make the good of others his or her own good. And to put that most succinctly, what I argue in the book is, by virtue of our embodiment, we're made for love and friendship, and for the law to be just, humane, and wise, it has to be built on that insight. And we're made for love and friendship because we, or as a function of our existence as corruptible, dependent, mutually connected bodies.
And what's striking about the way you just described this, being made for love and friendship, McIntyre's, notions of self-giving and so on, is, I mean, on the one hand, like, it completely coheres with Catholic teaching, right? Like Catholic
Yes.
social teaching.
Yes, it does.
What we just saw Pope Francis teaching in Fratelli Tutti. And on the other hand, it's not a faith-based claim, right? I mean, in fact, as you said earlier, almost in passing, this actually fits reality better. Most of us in our lives experience periods of great dependence, maybe lesser dependence, great dependence again, right? This fits a human life so much, apter than the alternative view, right? That has to view periods of dependence in people's lives, whether it's at the earliest stages or later stages, as surds, right? They're unintelligible, and therefore, therefore you're open to assisted suicide, like the Brittany Maynard cases and so on, right?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, we don't understand that you can participate in the networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, even as maybe forever or throughout your lifespan, as merely a passive recipient of unconditional love. So you don't have to ever be capable of cognitive agency to be a human being in the vision that I'm trying to sketch out in this book. But those folks are invisible through the lens of expressive individualism. And you're exactly right. I think, and the reason I'm optimistic about this vision being ultimately persuasive is that it really does cohere with our lived experience. As you say, there's nobody, and Bertrand Juvenel, French political philosopher once said, and he was talking about something else, he was talking about social contract theorists, but the line is so great, it's worthwhile to restate here that people who have this expressive individualist view are like childless men who've forgotten that they were children, right? The idea that you've forgotten something about your own dependence. And in fact, this is straight out of John Milton, Paradise Lost. This is straight out of Lucifer's talk to the army of angels, denying their creaturely status before God, saying, we don't have any recollection of being created. We have no recollection of being as any way other than we are now, which is powerful, willful, and capable of imposing our wills on others. And that's like a small privileged sliver of the population. And when you build laws on that, the only people that are benefited is that small sliver of the population.
So before we pivot to audience questions, which we'll do right after this, let's talk about optimism. You mentioned, you know, some grounds for optimism. One thing you mentioned is that public bioethics as a kind of a discipline involved in governance and law is often reactive, right?
Yes.
So it's responding to things. But we know law is not merely reactive. Law also has a kind of teaching function, an educational function, right? So do you see either already occurring glimpses of hope where the law is educating maybe in a way that conduces to what you're describing, or openings for the law to do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'll take the examples that that I use in the book. So, in the context of abortion, the American law of abortion is almost entirely a creature of Supreme Court jurisprudence, right? In 1973, the United States Supreme Court claimed, I think, in a really unpersuasive decision, that somehow the U.S. Constitution and the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which says, among other things, that that no person should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, so, that adopted in 1868, at a time when abortion was illegal almost everywhere in the United States. Right after ratification of that amendment, the state of Ohio banned abortion from the moment of conception on the grounds that it was child murder, in the language of the lawmakers in Ohio. Nobody thought that the protections of due process and equal protection that were adopted in the wake of the shameful history of chattel slavery after we fought a war meant that the states were not capable of extending protections to the weak and vulnerable unborn child. Okay, but in a 7-2 decision, the court says, well, we've discovered this right based on our understandings of privacy, which is, again, it's a good right at the heart of expressive individualism, the right to be left alone, to blaze your own trail, to formulate your own conception of what life is without intrusion from the state and its views. And so before we do anything on the question of abortion, that has to be undone. It has to be the case that the jurisprudence of abortion has to be unfolded, and the matter at least has to be returned to the political branches so that they can make steps in the direction of creating laws that reflect the genuine reality of our lived experience. Okay. Yeah. And I do see, in the context of abortion, certain kinds of efforts on the part of states, and you talked about disabilities. Like, for example, my own state of Indiana passed a law that said that a person may not seek an abortion solely for the purpose of eliminating a child who has a disability, or eliminating a child of a disfavored sex, or eliminating a child. And that's a pretty popular legal framework that's been adopted in other jurisdictions as well. And in that, I see a kind of commitment to the fragility and dependence of our brothers and sisters in the womb. So I'm optimistic about what I see politicians in those states trying to accomplish. But until the Supreme Court allows them to do that, that's going to be a tough road. And who knows? Maybe the Supreme Court will allow them to do it in short order. Only time will tell. But with respect to assisted reproductive technologies, there are some jurisdictions, not many. Louisiana comes to mind. That seeks to accommodate and respond to the deeply felt needs of parents who are seeking fertility treatments, who desperately wish to be parents and are finding themselves betrayed by their own bodies. Laws that declare that the in vitro human embryo is a juridical person, and it doesn't forbid in vitro fertilization, but it says if we're going to do this, we have to begin with the premise that all the players involved are not merely atomized wills, and then people incapable of that are subpersonal property that can be used to serve the interests of people who have the capacity to exercise their will. That's something that's interesting. And then assisted suicide and end of life decision making. I think there's grounds for optimism, because I think the more we think about our loved ones and people who are suffering, maybe people who've lost their ability to make decisions on their own behalf, or people who are suffering from depression and who wish and or feel themselves to be a burden to others and maybe want to commit suicide, the more we think about our own experiences with those loved ones, I think it becomes clear to us that we shouldn't project onto them the vision of human flourishing and autonomous decision making that undergirds the laws in those areas, because that's not who you're talking about. Even take a generic patient. A person who goes to the doctor doesn't go to the doctor to assert their unencumbered will. They go to a doctor because they're sick and they need help, and they want someone to take care of them who knows what they're doing and has their best interest at heart. And if we reflect on this, and you asked me at the beginning, and I haven't answered it yet, why do I characterize the decisions or the views of others,
Right.
who I think actually produce monstrous outcomes, right? Monstrous outcomes for vulnerable populations. Why do I try to do so in a way that those advocates would recognize their own voices in my description of what they're doing? And it has to do with what my wonderful colleague at Notre Dame, Sister Anna Stell, whom I'm sure you know, a theologian at Notre Dame, calls the hermeneutic of charity, right? If we're made for love and friendship, we really have to, the only way we're going to be persuasive to other people, and I don't mean this in an instrumental, cynical way, is to love them first. Love them before you start trying to persuade them. And in a genuine, this is reflected in the Catholic social tradition of hospitals and caring for the poor. And we don't proselytize before we feed people, before we take care of them. You take care of them first. And the people who disagree with me, as difficult as it might be emotionally, I have to work hard to imagine these people as my brothers and sisters, and to respond to them in a way that is respectful and genuinely loving. And I hope that will be a kind of countercultural, jarring sensation. And I hope they do the same for me, because I'm sure they disagree strongly with me as well.
Right. Well, it's definitely countercultural at this moment. Okay, so let's turn to some questions, and I'm just going to read these, Carter, and
Sure.
Do your best to follow. Okay, so the first one.
First one is, why are you so handsome? That's the first question. Could be for both of us.
Listen, surprisingly, it's not that, and it's not.
That's disappointing, but that's okay. Maybe the second question will be that.
I'll try to get a higher level of audience in the future. Okay, so Professor Snead, could you please explain how your view of the body differs from that of the far left of feminism? After all, the Bible of second wave feminism was entitled Our Bodies, Ourselves. There's some more to this, Carter, so if you want me to, I'll finish this, but that's really the thrust of it.
So let me,
perception of the body from
so I have to admit from the very beginning, I mean, I've read Carol Gilligan, in law school, I studied critical feminist studies and critical legal studies, critical race theory and all that. I am not versed enough in the feminist thought and feminist teaching to respond in a responsible way to the whole movement, the whole body of thought. So let's bracket let's give that caveat at the outset. But what's being said, I know for a fact, though, that Our Bodies, Ourselves made a robust case for abortion. And it did so largely within the same framework that was articulated by the philosophers that I do discuss in the book, for whom abortion rights was very important. Judith Jarvis Thompson, I've already mentioned, as well as Michael Tooley. There are two principal arguments for abortion. Philosophically, one is the bodily dependence argument, in which the unborn child is viewed as a kind of unwanted intruder who the woman has a right to exclude from her body and to reject. The other is a kind of personhood theory, that those who are incapable of formulating desires are not part of the moral and legal community, and therefore their interests must be subordinated to those who are women, who are capable of that kind of agency, namely a pregnant woman seeking an abortion. Right. I think that those arguments are pretty well tracked, the arguments made in Our Bodies, Ourselves. I'm sure there's a large aspect of it that I'm not appreciating, but I think in my book, what I argue is the notion that a woman, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way, the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, argues in her own work in the dissent in Gonzalez versus Carhart, which is the partial birth abortion case from 2007, that what abortion is for, as a policy matter, as a moral matter, is a necessary mechanism for a woman to realize her equality on the same footing with a man, so that she can both express herself sexually the way men do, but then not be subject to the unequal burdens natural burdens of unplanned pregnancy and unwanted pregnancy, that a woman has to have recourse to abortion in order to compete on an equal footing in the social and economic life of our nation. And all three of these arguments are rooted, I believe, in an anthropology that very closely tracks expressive individualism. It privileges the will, it privileges our own self-invented destiny, and it atomizes everybody involved in the equation. It's, again, the mother is not a mother. The mother is an individual cognitive agent seeking to realize her will. The unborn child is not even a person. The unborn child is a subpersonal being who's fighting over scarce resources. They're strangers.
Right.
And that vision of anthropology, I think, runs through at least the feminist, insofar as the feminist vision is reflected in the philosophers that I've been talking about. And I think it's vulnerable to the same critique that I made early on.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, second question. You argue convincingly that the body needs to be integral to public bioethics. Does our anthropology need to be more detailed than this to draw the best conclusion in bioethics, or is this claim all we need? In other words, is it sufficient?
Yeah,
right?
Sure. I think that, again, my aim in the book was to take a defective anthropology, which had some important truth in it, which is the reality of our cognitive capacities for those of us who have the capability to exercise that, which is an important part of our personal identity, and supplement it with our embodiment. So our vision I'm talking about really is a kind of integration of body and mind, or body and soul. It's not simply, you might criticize what I'm criticizing, not by calling it expressive individualism, you may call it angelism, right? Like the idea that Walker Percy talks about, the idea that we're just simply minds. That's really what we are, and the body is accident. Or the other is sort of bestialism, is the idea that all we are kind of animals, with a freakish speck of mind and an otherwise mindless universe. And that's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing that we are simply bodies. I'm arguing that we are a dynamic union of body and soul. And what our anthropology is lacking is an understanding of our embodiment and what that entails in terms of our obligations to one another, and what the law should recognize.
Right. Yeah. And if I understand it as well, you're not saying that your account is of itself sufficient to sort of provide the best account of what it means to be a human being. You're really at this point just interested in identifying, number one, this false anthropology that is engaging in this kind of dualism that makes people invisible, as you said earlier, and then saying the only solution to this is some form of embodiedness like we have in the Catholic theological tradition, but you're not really sort of aligning yourself with this or that version of that, at least at this point. Right?
That's right. No, exactly. This is ultimately a book about law and public policy. And it does, I think, go deeply into the flawed anthropology of expressive individualism. It roots it in its sort of intellectual genealogy, and it provides the beginning of a response that focuses on the sustaining, the construction and sustaining of these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, and the virtues that are necessary to promote and sustain that. But it's not meant to be a comprehensive account of what a human person is in a purely philosophical sense.
Right. Great. The next one, can you comment on what the President Bioethics Council has accomplished? What members are still active, et cetera? So maybe what you could do is maybe talk about your own experience there, like what you guys were able to accomplish, and maybe are you paying any attention to, is it still on? I don't even know.
There's not one anymore. So a very brief thumbnail history. So the first Bioethics Commission was created by the National Research Act that I mentioned earlier on as part of a response. And that was a national commission. It was a creature of Congress. Then it ultimately sunsetted and was replaced by the first President's Commission by President, I think it was President Carter or President Reagan, around that time, 79, 80. There emerged a new President's Commission, which became the model going forward. And every president, or most every president, had a similar kind of advisory body like that. The advisory body that I served was President George W. Bush's President's Council on Bioethics. It replaced President Clinton's National Bioethics Advisory Commission. And then President Obama replaced our committee or our council with his own council, which had a very different approach to it was much more pragmatic. It was much more focused on concrete public policy questions. Whereas ours, and this is a reflection of the leadership of Dr. Cass, really wanted to get back to first principles of human needs and human flourishing. And rather than going technology by technology, to ask questions about to get back to to have a council not of bioethicists, but rather on bioethics. And he composed it with in a very interdisciplinary way, having not professional bioethicists, but rather experts in political theory and theology and philosophy and law and medicine and science. And it was genuinely balanced. It was so balanced that the council frequently disagreed with one another and had a majority report and a minority report in their outputs. Whereas President Obama selected a much more ideologically homogenous group, which is more like what President Clinton had. And they tackled concrete questions, synthetic biology, and other sort of discrete questions, and came up with policy solutions or proposals that look a lot more like mainstream American bioethics. But then President Trump came into office in 2017 and did not create his own bioethics council. And in a lot of ways, the things that most concerned us at the President's Council, issues of embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and the like, were not taken up during the Trump administration. There was no, in fact, the embryonic stem cell funding policy of President Obama persisted into President Trump's tenure. Right. So President Trump maintained President Obama's policy of federally funding research that incentivizes the destruction of living human embryos, which a lot of people don't know, and virtually no one talks about. So the members of the President's Council on Bioethics are still active. Mary Ann Glennon was on our council. She just retired from Harvard, but is very much involved in the public square. She chairs the Committee on Human Rights for the Secretary of State. We have Leon Cass, who's still very much involved in writing and participating in conversations. Gil Mylander, Michael Sandel is obviously very active. He was a member of the council. Elizabeth Blackburn won the Nobel Prize. She's still very much involved in her own research. So yeah, people are individually involved in their own activities, but there has not been a President's Council on Bioethics since President Obama left office. And that, what I presume is the Trump administration was taking advice in a sort of more informal way through the Domestic Policy Council's office, or maybe the National Institutes of Health, or what have you. He kept on President Obama's director of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins. So that's another interesting piece of continuity. Yeah. So the Trump administration wasn't very much involved in bioethics in the sense, it's been very involved in the question of abortion, but not on the other issues that we grappled with.
Right. And one of the amazing things about that council that you were a part of, aside from just the cast, the incredible cast that you just identified, and even some of the younger lights like Eric Cohen and
Yuval Levin,
really brilliant men and women. One of its real achievements, I thought, was that it got its conversations into the public, and at a time, it's always the time, but at a time when it was needed to have these kinds of conversations. You had members. I think Pinker was involved at one point, right? But
he came as a guest. He was
but it provoked public conversation about really critical issues, and there's been silence even before Trump stopped it, right?
For sure.
But during Obama's, like you said, it was much more pragmatic, and it's as though the issues have gone away. And as we both know, these issues have not gone away. In fact, they've advanced, right?
They have, yeah. And in fact, there are essential developments involving gene editing and other kinds of potentially transformative technologies. And the absence of a council, absence of a kind of central national body debating these questions, but also, as you say, educating the public, disseminating it. We all, it's true of all councils, but our reports, our council meetings were always open to the public. They were extremely well attended. All of the books were free. But it's interesting because I think Chairman Cass's approach to the questions of bioethics were more intelligible to normal people, because he really did want to get back to first principles about what it means to be human, what's human flourishing, rather than what do we do about synthetic biology, right? Because once the question's framed that way, it becomes siloed in a group of experts, and normal people stop paying attention. And I think normal people would get a lot out of reading my book, because it's not just about discrete, highly technical questions. It's about these fun, and it's very much in the spirit of Leon Cass. In fact, my wife made a joke when she read the first iteration of the manuscript, said, "This reads like Leon Cass and Alistair McIntyre had a baby." And so, which is interesting because there's a whole chapter on assisted reproductive technology. But in any event, it's funny, but it's also true. I mean, this book reflects the kind of methodological commitments of McIntyre and Cass and Michael Sandel and Charles Taylor. So it's not conservative or liberal. It's just kind of broadly, I mean, for it to be kind of broadly human. I mean, the first thing we did as the President's Council on Bioethics, you may remember this, is we read a short story. We read The Birthmark.
Yeah, I remember that.
And we got a lot of pushback from that, from people like, why is this? This isn't a graduate seminar. This is supposed to be a bioethics committee. And it's a beautiful short story about hubris and intolerance of imperfection, and a very, very compelling way to start. And it was out of the gate a reflection of what Chairman Cass was going to do. And I think that's the right way to do bioethics. That's actually how we did bioethics at the inception of American public bioethics, with theologians in conversation with scientists and physicians and legal scholars, people like Paul Ramsey and others. You as a theologian, I mean, theologians had a much higher profile role to play in the bioethical discussions, the public bioethical questions, way more so than they do now.
Absolutely. And I mean, just a quick endorsement of your project. You say it, draws on these guys, but I would even say it's so accessible that for people who are not familiar with the McIntyres or Sandels or Taylors, et cetera, it actually introduces their thought to people. And so I invite people to look at this because it is accessible. It's attached to concrete examples, but also, makes its case plainly and effectively. Let's turn to a couple more questions. How can we better form future generations, children, students, et cetera, to understand and value the realities of dependence, vulnerability, limitation, et cetera? Okay, very practical.
It's a really wonderful question. And as I've said a couple times in different talks, I'm a lawyer, and as a person who's worked in government and intergovernmental institutions like UNESCO and the UN and the Council of Europe, there is a temptation to grand solutions, right? There's a temptation, like, we want to find a piece of legislation or the treaty that will fix this problem. But the truth is, it's a failure of love and friendship. It's a failure. I mean, how can we learn that our fragility and our dependence is take care of your grandparents? You know what I mean? Like, help take care of your disabled sibling. We have to get back to first principles and to reflect on those things that are so important to us. Most people want to take care of their grandparents, want to take care of their newborn, want to take care of their disabled sibling or cousin, or go work at the Catholic worker house, or go work, go somewhere and where you're serving other people. And the most pristine example of this, I think, is Mother Teresa, right? Mother Teresa says, if we don't have peace, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to each other. It's this fundamental belonging by virtue of our existence and our embeddedness in these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving that give rise to the sensibility, the sense of gratitude, the sense of obligation that we have to care for other people. So I think our interpersonal context matters a lot here. I think we need to be intentional about caring for other people and bringing vulnerable people into our orbit and caring for them. And if you've got a kid, take your kid with you to go help out at the Special Olympics, or take your kid to go to feed somebody at the Catholic worker house. Take your son or daughter with you to show what it means, or to take care of your grandmother or whatever. That to me is essential, but also because it's fundamentally a failure of love and friendship, but also as a legal matter, there are instances, and again, the law is extremely broad, fine-grained. You can do a lot with the law. The law can be intrusive. The law can be very laid back. The law can incentivize behaviors by funding them, for example. I'm not saying that we need an intrusive government to make us love each other, right? What I'm saying is that in some cases, the taking a step back and allowing for private ordering is the exact right thing to do. But there are instances in which the vulnerable fall between the cracks. And if the law is designed to do anything, or it should do anything, it's to protect vulnerable people from being abandoned or worse. And the law does need to step in, and the boundaries of the moral and legal communities have to be designed in a way that everybody counts.
Yeah, that's really great stuff. I mean, it brings to mind, the question is great because it's about the future, right? And And in a way, the future to the expressive individualist perspective is almost unintelligible, right? I mean, this is partly what we see, that we're seeing it in birth rate, right? I mean, catastrophic birth rate declines. We see it in our own culture where it becomes unintelligible to people why to have or adopt children, you know, into
Right.
their lives. And what you're describing is future oriented, right? It's about, I mean, it's really longitudinal. It's about looking behind you at, right, you are a child, to go back right to what you said earlier, you're a child of men and women, of course, and then looking forward to having children or to being a grandparent and so on. And expressive individualism struggles with that kind of relationality, right?
It does, and especially at the end of life, right? Like and
Absolutely.
I mean, Solzhenitsyn says that, you know, that the modern man is death haunted, right? Because when you become your own measure of significance, and you're you're the only thing that matters, your death represents the end of the universe, right? And so,
Right.
and that's terrifying.
Right.
And you don't have a sense of your embeddedness and your relationship to others who will live on after you're gone.
Right.
And you know, you saw this. You mentioned Brittany Maynard, the very beautiful, appealing woman who ended her own life in Oregon because in
Right.
California she couldn't do it. She had a certain kind of brain cancer, and before she became debilitated, she went and took her own life. And you see that sort of example of a normal person. You also see it in what was called the philosopher's brief, which was
Mhm.
filed by the most important philosophers of the modern era: John Rawls, Nozick, you know, Ronald Dworkin, all these Judith Jarvis
Right.
Thompson, all
Right.
these moral philosophers who filed a brief in the two assisted suicide cases in the Supreme Court in the late 90s, where the question was, is there a constitutional right to assisted suicide? And they said, well, of course there is. There is, because first of all, our abortion jurisprudence guarantees a right to self-determination that, rightly understood, extends to the end of life, to be the author of the conclusion of your own story, right? And it is, and thankfully that view was roundly rejected 9-0 by the Supreme Court. But it might have turned out differently, right, if the
Sure.
court had taken the same
Sure.
approach as they did in Roe.
Right.
But what that reflects also is the vision of the conclusion of a life characterized by expressive individualism is to write the end of your own story and to live your authenticity and to die your authenticity.
Okay. Super stuff. One more question, Carter, and then we'll finish up. Are there other areas of law and public policy where you see this flawed anthropology than simply public bioethics? Are there other places where, you know, we'd find this?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the problem of anthropology. So I try to teach my students at Notre Dame, and this is not unique to me. This is what we teach. The law school is distinct in this way because we really do, as a community of faculty, recognize that the richest way to understand law is through its normative lens. That is to say,
Hmm.
what is the purpose of the law? What is the law designed
Yeah.
to promote and avoid? And
Right.
then more deeply still, what vision of the person is animating all this? So that if you don't know what the vision of the person is, and you don't know what the normative ends of law are, then you can't say if it's wise or humane or just or inhumane
Sure.
or arbitrary and capricious. You just don't know. And I think that any legal question, any policy question, is most richly understood through this method, this anthropological inductive method. And I'm sure it's the case that if you were to look at immigration or economic policy or
Mhm.
whatever, if your vision of the human person, when the full population of human persons includes people who are not capable of being a rational decider, and your only point of reference for what a person is this atomized rational deciding will, then there are going to be people who you miss, and they're going to be the most vulnerable people. So I'm sure that's true in other contexts, and we'd have to take a look at it one by one to sort that out. But I'm confident that we could find that to be the case in labor policy and
Sure.
economic and across the board.
Yeah. Well, fantastic, Carter. Thanks so much. This was really, you know, a really great conversation. Thanks for giving me the occasion to read the book. It's excellent. Like I said, I do encourage people to read it. It's a deceptively easy book to read because it's dealing with complicated issues, but it's so plainly presented, so well done, and really well structured. Carter, I think you ought to be proud of it, and I think it's going to be an important intervention at a time when we all need it. My pleasure to see you again.
Great
Everybody,
to see you
thank you
too.
so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us at the IHE. And if you want to see this again or share the video for this, we'll have the video up linked through our website, you know, at the Institute for Human Ecology. I don't even know my website. How about that, Carter?
That's good. That's
Effective, right?
yeah.
Anyway, good night, everybody. Carter,
Thank
stay
you.
in touch. Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye,
Thank you so
guys.
much.